Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you for joining us for one of our talks today. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by writer and director Jonathan Wysocki to talk all about his film Dramarama. And what I love about this film is that it feels like a really personal endeavor. And in kind of putting together the initial storyline in the way that you've described the genesis, it sounds like you really went back to revisiting your own time as a teenager and thinking a lot about the interpersonal dynamics amongst you and your friends. And because this is such an ensemble piece within the cast, I was very interested in how, in the early stages, kind of taking your own personal experiences really led into not just the creation of individual characters, but who you wanted them to be as a group and as an entity with each other in the film.
Yeah, no, thank you. I started with rereading my high school diary and uh, crying a lot. I'm just kidding. And there was definitely something about the dynamic that I had with my friends in terms of those highs and lows and how intense everything was. And the joys were really joyous and the arguments were really argumentative, and how so much of that for me personally was coming from a place of trying to find myself, and particularly being closeted in the early 90s and growing up in a very sort of religious conservative environment, that a lot of this dynamic was kind of coming out through play in the theater, in a sort of a safe space where you can be whoever you want to be and change your moods and whatever your is sort of on the inside, you can sort of let that come out on the outside. And there was something kind of delicious to me about the intensity of our friendships and what we were working through, and this sort of special nature, I think, particularly of theater kids, as having this outlet where you can wear a mask, where you can sort of become somebody else and pretend like you're someone else, and then snap back into who you are. That I just thought it was delicious territory for making a film. So that's sort of the origin of everything.
And in the writing process, because you really have managed to shape each of these characters so uniquely and so individually, was there any sort of process that you had when you were working on the script of just spending a lot of time with each character individually and really thinking about their voice to make sure that that was always coming across in all of the scenes? Because there are so many scenes in the film as well where all of them are together in the same room, and that still comes out in those moments.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It was definitely a draft by draft process where I would finish a draft and then realize, have someone read it that I trusted, and that person would say, "Oh, this character is not quite sharp enough yet. I don't quite get them," or whatnot. And then I would do another pass just for that character. And there was a certain amount of separating the real people from the fictional people they became as well, in that there's a lot of details about me and my friends in this film. That's sort of the origin, the seed of it. But then the final product is really a lot of layers and layers of fiction that came out through the writing process in order to crystallize each character and make them their own thing that's not really 100% a carbon copy of the original version.
Yeah. And you were touching before upon part of the dynamic being that internal fear and anxiety that can come from a really religious conservative upbringing, and some of the things which are really distilled into these young people to the point where they don't know if their own friends are going to be accepting of them in certain spaces. And we really see that journey through the character of Gene really struggling to tell his friends that he's gay. And so I was very interested in how, particularly with his character, you really wanted to explore kind of the idea of a much bigger theme and conversation, but within the intimacy of him as a singular character.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like there's so many great coming out movies, and some of them are dramatic and bad things happen, and some of them are lighter and good things happen. I was very interested in sort of really focusing more on the struggle of the process itself, because I remember that being so hard. And it's so interesting that your closest friends, the people who you should, trust the most and love the most and whatnot were, extra hard for me to come out to, because I just didn't know how things were going to land based off of a history of growing up in an environment where we were all very religious. Uh, and so I think I was more interested in the process rather than the product of that coming out stage, because of the religious aspects. And I feel like, even though this is definitely a window into the early 90s in that regard, because nobody at my high school was out in the early 90s, it was just not happening for anybody. There are still places all across America where the gene situation is still very much happening. And even among your closest friends, because of the religious conservative environment, you may not feel safe to come out. And so I was really interested in making sure that the film held that space, so that there was an alternative to the coming out story that was out there for, especially for kids that are really struggling with it, and knowing that it's okay to have those feelings about whether or not you feel safe enough to come out, and that you should also know that you will find that space eventually, that you'll find the right time and space to do that. And it may require, you're moving on later in your life, moving on from those people, not to give anything away in the film.
Yeah. And there's that one scene in particular where he's in the car with one of his best friends, and he's kind of almost dancing around the subject and saying, well, my coworker, to really feel it out. And I just thought that that scene spoke to a lot of the intricacies of their relationship, their friendship, their history with each other. But again, exactly everything that you were saying is still channeled through that moment. And so wanted to ask you about the intricacies and all of the different aspects that you really wanted to bring into that one singular scene, because it has such a level of intimacy to it.
Thank you. Yeah, that scene, there's definitely a root of that scene in my real life, where one of my close friends in high school was also gay, and we were at different points in our journeys of coming out, and I just remember the awkwardness of it, and the testing of the waters, and the idea of, I remember when I got to college, I told I asked my roommate about this situation, about this girl, when I was really talking about a boy. And those sort of games that are kind of played, because you really want, Gene in that scene really wants the love and validation of Oscar, and is so afraid of losing that, and is so afraid of bad things that may come of just being truthful. That, again, I feel like that's a very common thing that a lot of teenagers go through, is not being direct, because you just don't know how things are going to play out, and you're sort of living in this in between space when you really, the healthy thing to do is be honest and vulnerable.
I also wanted to talk about working with the cast in the film, because through the fact that this was an independent feature, there wasn't very much time to spend with them beforehand. And I think you said that you had about 4 hours of rehearsal, but that there was an opportunity to have a coffee or have a lunch with each of them individually. And so when you go into a project knowing that you're not going to have the time to rehearse and really talk through a lot of the intricacies scene by scene, how did you want to really utilize those conversations that you were having, even if it was just a casual lunch setting, in terms of, these are the character details that I really think that you need to know. Here's the information I want to give you beyond what's on the page. And also in return, what the types of questions were that the cast were asking you.
It's a really great question. I would backtrack for a second and say that a huge part of what made that whole thing work was actually just casting the right actors. And that's a big testament to my casting directors, Sunday Bowling and Meg Mormon, who, they just saw hundreds of kids and they found the right kids for each role, which was amazing. And the actors they cast were smart people. They were smart people who who really listened in those meetings. And I think my biggest goal in those meetings was to be able to clarify what the secret fears and desires are of each character and how that tied into what was happening during the night. And also make it clear what interrelationships they had with one another that were maybe not 100% clear on the page. Because I find that interesting as well, is that when you have a friend group, you have different relationships with each of those friends. There's like another layer to the friendships in terms of who you feel extra connected to and who you don't feel extra connected to. So making sure that map was there for them was really important to me. And then, in terms of questions, it really varied on the actor. And uh, the interesting thing, I think, for those meetings was sort of discovering who was more like the character and who was less like the character, where it was going to be a little more of a journey on certain points, and then in some instances where it was like, oh no, I get this person very deeply. I am this person to a certain degree. So that was a sort of an interesting process in terms of finding that out. But it's for what it's worth. Those meetings were really valuable and productive, as short as they were. And I got very lucky with just the chemistry in terms of all of them. When they got together, they just loved each other and had so much fun with each other and trusted each other so much. So that was really a sort of fortunate aspect.
Yeah. And that challenge of time also carries over once you're in production as well, because when you're shooting a film in 16 days, you have to be moving really quickly, be really smart with the coverage that you're getting, know your setups going in. And so, what were the most important details for you creatively to ensure that you had really buttoned up? Okay, when we get onto set, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, this is what's going to be on the left side of the frame, this is going to be sitting on the couch, this is where the actors are going to be, so that when you landed, you could just go straight into really spending as much time as possible actually shooting and actually focusing on characters?
That's a really great question, and I have to say that I did not over plan for that on with the film, even though that was definitely a huge challenge in terms of getting that coverage and getting through those days. I every morning I would, like an hour before shooting, I would sort of draw a map of what I felt like the choreography needed to be, uh, and what that sort of coverage was going to be. And I did that in part because I one of the things that I really wanted to capture in this friend group was that sort of feeling of improv and sort of knowing when they were at their high point, when they were at their low point, when they were going into antics, when things got really serious, and making sure that the coverage and the camera were mimicking wherever they were emotionally. And so some of that was just trying to be as inventive as the characters were. And then sometimes it was the opposite. So, the scene where JD comes in and it's like the record scratch is on the game, and suddenly it's like the wolf among the sheep, and everything gets really awkward. That I planned out very, very carefully, because I wanted it to feel not as sort of fun and improvised as what came before it. So yeah, I feel like it sort of depended on what the scene required in terms of how much planning we were kind of doing.
Yeah. And that scene in particular with JD that you were mentioning sounds like it was one of the longest scenes within the script to shoot as well. Because when you're shooting about 7 pages with all of those characters on screen, there's an extreme amount of coverage. And to the point that you were just making about really having the camera mimic and follow and flow with where each of the characters were emotionally, how does that then fit into a scene like that, where you're really tracking all of these characters individually, but again, with what at the beginning, with that overall group dynamic between them?
Yeah, The strategy with that scene was to start with these really kind of awkward wides, and then just keep getting tighter and tighter until, by the end of the scene, we have these massive close-ups of each of the characters' faces as they're sort of receiving his judgment. And the the fun part about that was just that the actors were so good that it was easy to do. But definitely the challenge was making sure to get every single small reaction and moment, because in the editing room, we just, you want those choices in terms of who is reacting to who at what moment. And if you don't have that on that one day that you shoot that scene, then, you're up a creek. So yeah, I definitely felt like that we had a strategy of what we wanted for that particular day, and it was a rough day. I'm not going to lie, to get all of that coverage and to just keep going over the scene again and again and again, to make sure to get every single small moment between everyone. I don't know if that answered your question. I felt like I was about to. I felt like I was about to answer it in a different way, and then that happened.
No, it does. It does. It's so fascinating to hear the detail for a scene like that. And whether it's that scene or any of the other moments where they're all together, it's so great how you manage to flow between the different types of dynamics, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier. The highs are so high, the lows are so low. And then on top of that, you also have the fact that there are theatrical elements. They're there dressed up in costume at the beginning. So even the act of arriving at a party, they're breaking into character with each other. And all of this happens within each scene. It's not, okay, this is the moment where they're stepping into a character and we're really seeing their imagination. And this is the moment where things feel a little emotional heavy for them. Was it something that even when you first started writing the script was important to you to be able to flow between all those myriads of tones and spaces throughout the entire film?
It was, yeah, it was, because that was kind of the lightning in the bottle that I was so interested in recapturing. I was watching high video of my friends and I from 1994, and the silly things that we would do, and just like the energy shifts in terms of the highs and the lows, and it felt so authentic that I definitely wanted to try to recreate that in the film itself. And I think that all teenagers have that to a certain degree, but again, I feel like it's really something specific to theater kids, and and uh, and those sort of highs and lows are just sort of part of what it is to be a teenager. And in this particular story, you're putting them in this emotionally high stakes situation where this is their last night together, and they probably can't express the amount of anxiety they may have over that, but it's all going to manifest in these outbursts of energy where suddenly they're improvising, and then suddenly they're yelling at each other, and then suddenly someone's crying, and you get this sort of range of pent up emotions that are all kind of coming out. And again, I feel like that's something that maybe I even forgot about my own teenage experience until I really kind of dug back into that time period and re-examined how those energies just kept shifting all the time.
Yeah. I mean, to the point that you were just making about the manifestation of emotions coming out through the more theatrical moments, whether it's them breaking into a sketch or stepping into a character for a moment, that also gives us such a window into their internal world and their internal lives, but also who they are creatively. And because these are all characters who are looking at pursuing themselves as artists and storytellers, how did that give you a totally different space to play with them in terms of their inner world as characters?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that was like the delicious part for me, is that meta layer to everything, where you're dealing with performers who are performing, and there's these layers of masks and who they really are, and being able to try on different identities and try on different masks, and yet they're also theater kids. This is what they actually do, and the sort of deliciousness of that, I feel like, is the paradox of when you're performing, whether or not that is hiding from who you are, or whether or not that's actually showing a different side of you or something that's maybe more realistic. Like I feel like drag is an interesting aspect of that. The there's that HBO reality show We're Here that I'm really obsessed with because I think it's so amazing. And I think one of the profound things about that show is taking people who are not never have never done drag before and watching what happens when you put them in drag and make them perform on a stage and seeing this whole other aspect of themselves that come out. And so I feel like there's this kind of delicious space that that performance holds where yes, I think the sort of simplistic part is that you're hiding from reality and it's an escape. But I think the more complex answer is that there's really more truth in what happens when you take on a performance rather than the lie of the performance that might seem like it's what's happening.
Yeah. And with the aspects of this film which were really personal, it transcends beyond it just being about the characters and their friendship and their upbringing, but it also carries through into the on-screen as well with a lot of the details that we're seeing in frame, with the fact that I think you raided your parents' house for a lot of the production design details to do set decoration. And was that something where you just immediately knew, okay, I remember that we've got all of these items in my childhood home that we can pull in? And how did that the items that you grabbed from their house actually then influence the way that you were shaping a lot of the other details on screen and what we're seeing in a frame based on these are the objects that these characters are interacting with?
That's a great question. So I am as nostalgic as the characters in the film. In terms of that, I had a lot of stuff that was in my parents' attic from high school in boxes, much to my father's dismay. And I was very adamant when I wrote the script about making sure that there were a lot of things that meant something to me in the frame. This is so pretentious to sort of quote Alfonso Cuarón because I am not Alfonso Cuarón in any way, shape, or form. But someone asked him at one point with Roma, why do you have all this stuff from your own past in this set design? Like nobody knows that it's yours. And he was like, I know. That's what's important to me is that I know that it's mine, and I know that it's stuff that I grew up with. And that was kind of a similar thing for me. I personally wanted those different pieces of my childhood and who I was back then in the frame itself. Even the clothes that some of the actors wear are either my clothes or my brother's clothes that we still have, hoarders that we still had in our parents' house. And for me, there's just something more. There's something about those details that I really do honestly feel like it translates more as authenticity on the screen rather than something that was found in some thrift store that actually has no emotional meaning at all connected to it. So yeah, I was pretty excited about that aspect. And my production designer, was not only there for the raiding of the living room, and took a whole bunch of my father's paintings off the walls and threw them in a van. But she was also really great about seeing the value in all of these things that she knew had personal content to them and how she used them in her design as well. So it was just fun. It was honestly just fun because I love the idea of recreating your past.
I really love how the personal touches every single aspect of the making of this film and want to thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today, Jonathan. So thank
Oh,
you.
thank you so much, Mara. It's been a pleasure.